A stranger found dead on a quiet village train. Murder hides in plain sight. Welcome to Echo Files. I am your host, Walter Finch. Share where you're listening from below. I love seeing your comments. Now, let's begin. The afternoon had settled into that gentle, drowsy quiet peculiar to late summer in the English countryside. In the village of Bramble Halt, the most notable disturbance to the peace was the occasional rattle of the branch-line train as it trundled past the hedgerows, vanishing beyond the copse toward the little station. Mrs. Amelia Rowcroft's garden tea was the event of the day, drawing a modest but eager gathering of local ladies and a few gentlemen who had come for sandwiches, gossip, and the faint thrill of knowing they were in respectable company. Miss Jane Marple, visiting her old friend Mrs. Harriet Finch, sat beneath a broad striped parasol, teacup in hand, her knitting bag resting at her feet. Her eyes, however, were not upon the cucumber sandwiches nor the neat rows of marigolds bordering the lawn, but on the small details. The quick glance exchanged between Mrs. Partridge and young Mr. Lionel Brooks, the stiffness in Mrs. Rowcroft's smile whenever her niece Clarissa addressed her, and the odd way the new curate, Reverend Phelps, kept checking his pocket watch as though the hour mattered to him more than polite conversation. It was Miss Finch's habit to chatter without much pause, so Miss Marple listened with the patient expression of one who knows the value of letting others talk themselves into indiscretions. And of course, Harriet was saying, everyone knows that the last train from here leaves at 9:30 sharp. Such a sensible hour for those of us who value our rest. But Lionel insists on using it whenever he's up in town for his business. The pause before that last word was noticeable. Lionel, seated within earshot, smiled faintly without looking up from his plate, a little too composed to be natural. A sudden commotion drew everyone's attention. Old Mr. Carter, the station master, appeared at the gate, hat in hand, face pale under his weathered skin. "Mrs. Rowcroft," he called, his voice tight. "I'm sorry to intrude, but, well, there's been an incident at the station. A man's been found in one of the carriages on the last train, and I'm afraid he's dead." The tea table erupted in startled exclamations. Mrs. Partridge's cup rattled in its saucer, Clarissa pressed her hand to her mouth, and Reverend Phelps muttered something about dreadful business before glancing again at his watch. Miss Marple, without the slightest outward alarm, set down her teacup and folded her hands neatly in her lap. "Dead, you say?" Mrs. Rowcroft repeated, her voice trembling. "Do you mean—" "Not an accident, ma'am," Mr. Carter interrupted, lowering his voice though everyone could hear. "The doctor's certain of it. Strangled. And from the look of him, it happened before the train even reached Bramble Halt." There was a long, uneasy silence, in which the distant drone of bees seemed oddly loud. Miss Marple's eyes rested briefly on each face, noting whose expression was of shock, whose of fear, and whose, as in young Lionel Brooks' case, was curiously blank. "Who was the man?" asked Mrs. Finch. Mr. Carter hesitated. "Name's Ernest Colston. Not local. But he had a return ticket from Paddington, and something about the way he was found. Well, Inspector Graves will be wanting to speak to anyone who saw the train come in last night." Miss Marple's fingers moved absently to her knitting bag, as though the news had reminded her of a dropped stitch. But her mind was already turning over the details. The time of the last train, the strangers it sometimes brought, the nervous glances at this afternoon's gathering, and the peculiar truth that in a village like Bramble Halt, it was often the smallest, most seemingly harmless things that hid the deadliest secrets. If you like, I can continue with the second section, where the village begins whispering and theories start to form. For a moment after Mr. Carter's announcement, The garden seemed to hold its breath. The chatter that had filled the air moments before drained into a murmurous undertow, and people began to rise with the same polite haste one adopts when the weather turns or a wasp hovers too near the cake. Mrs. Rowcroft fussed with her napkins and insisted that everyone have a fresh cup while we collect ourselves. But the trays went untouched. It was not often that death, untidy, unasked for, intruded upon cucumber sandwiches and the familiar clink of good china. Even in Bramble Halt, where life kept to its rails as faithfully as the little branch line, the last train had brought something in that no one had been expecting. Miss Marple did not move immediately. It is a mistake, she knew, to confuse motion with understanding. She watched instead. Mrs. Partridge had that pinched look of an upright woman whose conscience was perfectly clean, but whose imagination was not. She held herself very straight, as if poor posture were a moral failing. Young Lionel Brooks took the opportunity to adjust his cufflinks, the habit of a man who likes his hands occupied when he cannot control his tongue. Clarissa, the niece, stared into the middle distance, not so much shocked as calculating. And the curate, Reverend Phelps, after one last glance at his watch, slipped it back into his pocket and folded his hands. The picture of dutiful resignation. Except that resignation was a strange emotion for a man merely hearing bad news. There is a kind of stillness which belongs to people thinking about their own arrangements rather than the dead. "Harriet, dear," Miss Marple said softly, "perhaps we should take that jar of gooseberry jelly to Mr. Carter's wife, as we've been meaning to. It is always a comfort to have something sweet at such times." She gave the slightest of smiles. "And as the station is so very near, we might bring it along now." Harriet Finch, to whom the habit of doing kindnesses was as natural as breathing, brightened through her anxiety. Yes, of course. Poor Mrs. Carter. One forgets the wives always have the worst of it, with their husbands out at all hours. She lowered her voice. "Will Inspector Graves be very cross with us for getting underfoot?" "Inspector Graves," Miss Marple returned, gathering her knitting bag and rising, "is not a cat. And even a cat will allow an old woman to sit where she won't be in anyone's way." They made a small departure of it, with reassuring words to Mrs. Rowcroft, who had begun to look as though she might dissolve into trembling at any moment. Clarissa, asked by her aunt to fetch more sugar, said she would and did not go. Lionel excused himself with a murmured explanation of a telegram he must send. The curate offered a general prayer for guidance and also contrived to be among the first to leave. Miss Marple tucked away these simple facts as one tucks pins into a pincushion, useful items, easy to retrieve at need. The walk to the station took them along the hedgerows and across the little footbridge where children once chalked their names on the timbers. Harriet carried the jelly pot as solemnly as if it were a christening font. Mr. Carter's wife received them on the back step with flour on her hands. She had been in the middle of kneading and kept apologizing for it, which is what decent women do when something dreadful interrupts the baking. A few sympathetic phrases and a promise to look in later made a good bridge to the practical question of whether Mr. Carter was at the station, and might they speak a word with him about the arrangements for the afternoon train, as Miss Finch hoped to go to St. Mary Mead tomorrow and wished to understand the timetable. The timetable, it should be acknowledged, was perfectly posted in the station hall. But there are some questions that are less about information than about nearness. They found Mr. Carter at the platform, looking several years older than he had at the garden gate. His cap was still askew from where he had thrown it on. He seemed relieved to see faces that promised comfort rather than curiosity, and explained in fragmentary phrases what could be explained. The body had been found that morning when the cleaner opened a third-class compartment on the last carriage. The blind had been left half pulled down on the window, which was unusual for the line. The doctor, Dr. Penrith, fetched by bicycle, said strangulation, and Inspector Graves had been telephoned from Much Hamilton, which had a proper station for such things. Had he any luggage? Miss Marple asked, her voice as mild as if inquiring whether the roses were blooming well for him this year. A small leather case, ma'am. Mr. Carter corrected, himself. Good make. But there's dispute whether it belonged to him. Ticket said Ernest Colston. No one saw him alight, for he didn't. Conductor remembers a quiet gentleman getting on at Paddington with a return. No fuss. And the compartment door? Miss Marple's eyes wandered toward the carriage itself, shunted to the far line, a sullen dark box waiting for attention. Not locked, he said, looking down. We lock up at night. The cleaner found him slumped against the corner seat, cord tight, horrible thing to see. Cord's the bell rope, if you please, pulled right from its fitting. I suppose a man doesn't care how he frightens others when he's about murder. Or he makes use of what is to hand, Miss Marple murmured. There is a difference. She let this sit while the afternoon train gave a soulful whistle far down the line. Harriet clutched the jelly. Mr. Carter, will Inspector Graves be very long? Any minute, Mr. Carter said, glancing toward the road. And indeed, the inspector came then with a purposeful stride, broad-shouldered under a plain tweed coat, a man who believed in straight lines and short answers. He nodded to Miss Marple with a sort of recognition that had grown between them on prior occasions when Bramble Halt had suffered lesser but still inconvenient upsets. Miss Marple, he said. Miss Finch, I hope you've not come to take the cleaner's job from me. We have brought jelly, Miss Marple said, and an old woman's eyes, which are sometimes good for seeing what busy men have no time for. She stood tidy and unobtrusive, while Inspector Graves spoke to Mr. Carter, took down notes, then sent a constable to keep the curious back, when he invited Miss Marple and Miss Finch to step inside the carriage. While we're still set to rights, it was done with that mixture of resignation and respect that practical men reserve for the useless things which inexplicably produce results. The compartment smelled faintly of dust and the sour tang of old smoke. The seats were upholstered in a faded pattern of leaves. The blind, half drawn, cut the light across the doorway so that those inside would have been in a line of shadow to anyone passing on the platform. Miss Marple registered that first, a small privacy provided by habit rather than intention. She looked to the luggage rack where dust had settled everywhere except a clean oval, as though something round had lain there recently and been removed. A hat box, perhaps, or a circular tin. On the floor near the corner seat was a smudge of something pale and powdery. Chalk, she thought. She was too far-sighted now for minute examination. But chalk has a way of clinging to the imagination. Children, timetables, and tailor's marks all use it with equal ease. Graves pointed at the bell cord, its severed end tied in a crude loop. Whoever did it improvised but knew his strength, he said. Marks suggest he stood over. The man, no struggle to speak of. Now then, Miss Marple, your impressions. Only that the murderer is a person who is not at home with mess, Miss Marple said placidly. He, or she, has a tidy mind. The blind, half-drawn, suggests a preference for concealment without announcing itself. The cord was cut neatly rather than frayed. And the victim, was he well dressed? Decent suit, Graves said. Shoes polished, clean linen, city sort. A return ticket from Paddington, which implies he meant to go back, Miss Marple said. One does not take a return if one is going to change one's life by running away with a lady or eloping with a fortune. One takes a single for that sort of thing. Returns are for people who mean to put everything back in its place. She lifted her gaze to the rack again. Do we know if anyone in the village rode the last train last night? Graves's pen ticked against his notebook. Young Brooks says he did. Arrived back from town. I'll speak to him. The curate claims he was at the vicarage all evening preparing Sunday notices. Mrs. Partridge states firmly she was at home with a hot water bottle. Mrs. Rowcroft says her niece had a headache and retired early. His mouth flattened. That's a great many headaches for one small evening. Change of weather, Miss Marple said, as if agreeing. It often produces nerves. They left the carriage for the platform's clearer air. Harriet, who had borne the interior bravely, sighed in earnest relief. Graves dismissed them kindly, but not unwatchfully, knowing that people said things to Miss Marple they did not say to him. As they walked back along the platform, Miss Marple saw a figure hovering near the station door. A young woman in a clerk's tweed coat a size too big, clutching a string bag as if it were a talisman. "Excuse me," the girl said in a rush, addressing Harriet in that way people do when they cannot quite bring themselves to address a stranger whose eyes make them feel known. "Are you Mrs. Finch? You gave me stamps last Christmas when the post was late." "Lillian, isn't it?" Harriet said warmly. "Lillian Drew. How is your mother's rheumatism?" "Up and down, ma'am," Lillian said, glancing nervously at Miss Marple, then facing her as though drawn. "I didn't want to say in front of the inspector, I don't want any trouble, but I work at the refreshment room at Much Hamilton, and the gentleman, Mr. Colston, he had tea there last evening, just before the last train. He seemed, well, not ill, but as if he were waiting for somebody who was late. He kept looking at the door, and he had a hat box with him, a green one." Smart Miss Marple's attention rested very gently upon the girl. "A hat box is a dear thing to carry for a gentleman," she said. "Did he have anything written upon it?" "Only a travel sticker," Lillian said. "From Hatherley's, the milliner in town. But when the train came in and he went out to the platform, he didn't have the box anymore. I thought perhaps he'd left it. But I looked after and it was gone. He must have handed it to the person he was waiting for." "Did you see the person?" Graves, who had reappeared in that way policemen have of materializing at the scent of proper information, asked with surprising gentleness. Lillian shook her head. "No, sir. I was fetching a fresh pot. Only," she hesitated, "only I heard him say, 'It will do for tonight then. Tomorrow is better.' Soft-like, not angry. And he had a little cough when he laughed. Not unpleasant. I mean, he seemed kind." "Thank you," Graves said. He took her name and address and reassured her that telling the truth was the opposite of trouble. When she had gone, he looked at Miss Marple with a mixture of consternation and interest. "A hat box, and our rack shows the ghost of one. Someone met him at Much Hamilton, took the box, and then at some point he ended strangled before reaching Bramble Halt. The obvious trail is to Hatherley's, but I'll warrant half the ladies in the county buy feathers there." "Feathers have their own language," Miss Marple said mildly. "So do boxes. Some people carry them like parcels, some like trophies, some like burdens they wish to shed as soon as possible. You can tell a great deal by how a thing is held." They parted at the station entrance, Inspector Graves to send his constable to Hatherley's and to Lionel Brooks, and Miss Marple and Harriet to take the quieter road back. The village was already netting itself in speculation. Two men outside the greengrocer's spoke of foreigners, with that large, unhelpful word. A child, listening, began repeating foreigners in pleased tones, as if it were a secret spell. At the post office, the bell jangled twice for each whisper. Gossip, Miss Marple knew, spreads most thickly where knowledge is thinnest. She kept her counsel. They had not reached the turning to the lane when they encountered Lionel Brooks himself, striding with an air of purposeful innocence that would have made Miss Marple smile if she had been less well trained. He tipped his hat with that glittering ease of a young man who has paid attention to his reflection. "Shocking business," he said. "I was on the last train, you know. Didn't see a thing." He produced this not as apology but as credential. "Sat in the second carriage from the end. Oaks, quiet as the grave. If I'd known." He spread his hands like a conjurer. "I should have called the guard." "Did you ride alone, Mr. Brooks?" Miss Marple asked. He blinked. "As it happens, yes. I value my solitude. Exhausting day in town." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed. "Solitude can be most refreshing. One hears no voices at all." She allowed this to rest. "You must have got in after 9. 9:29, he said, just a shade too promptly. "I looked at the station clock. It loses 2 minutes, you know. I told Mr. Carter last week." He smiled, then checked himself, as if remembering the gravity of the occasion. "Forgive me, Miss Marple. One tries to be helpful." "Helpfulness," Miss Marple said, "is a habit like any other. It tells on one's character." She inclined her head and they passed on, leaving Lionel to his purposeful walking and his careful times. Back at Mrs. Rowcroft's garden, the tea had become a post-mortem by other means. The guests had thinned. The curate had gone. Clarissa was waiting at the gate, as if for a particular someone. When she saw Miss Marple, she approached with a small, deliberate smile. "Aunt Amelia is lying down," she said. "All this excitement. I'm sure you understand." Her tone suggested that Miss Marple, being kindly and elderly, would understand anything she told her to. "I've sent for salts." "How thoughtful," Miss Marple said. "You are a very devoted niece." Clarissa dropped her gaze modestly in the way pretty girls learn so young that it becomes second nature. "One must be," she said. "Oh, Miss Marple, did you see the inspector? Will they be asking questions? I only wonder because I had the most frightful headache last night and went up early. And I should hate to make a muddle of times if they ask." Miss Marple looked at her with the serene candor of someone who has lived long enough to see most things twice. "Headaches," she said, "are very obliging in their timing. They always come when they are most required." A faint shadow crossed Clarissa's face. She colored and then laughed. "You are very droll," she said. "If you see Lionel, tell him Aunt wants a word after supper. It's about the tenants at the Rose Cottage, nothing to do with anything." "Of course," Miss Marple said. When Clarissa had gone, Harriet let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "Jane, dear," she whispered, "you speak to them as if they were all naughty children. Do you really think Lionel?" "My dear," Miss Marple said, guiding her friend to a bench beneath the laburnum, "I think that when a stranger is murdered in a place where nothing much happens, those who say they saw nothing are either telling the truth or protecting themselves from seeing too much. And that is not always guilt." Her fingers moved lightly over the rim of her knitting bag. "Consider, for example, the curate's watch. He looked at it 3 times after the news. That suggests his timetable is pressing on his mind." "Sunday notices," Harriet suggested. "Possibly," Miss Marple said. "But I have observed that men who keep their own time very exactly dislike clocks that are wrong. Lionel's remark about the station clock was intended for the inspector. He gave it to me instead. And then there is the hat box. If Mr. Colston handed it to someone at Much Hamilton, and if he boarded with only his case, then the person who took the hat box valued it more than the owner did. Hat boxes are awkward burdens. One does not volunteer for them unless one has a good reason. What sort of reason? Oh, Miss Marple said, as if she were thinking of jam recipes. Women have many. Concealment, display, gift-giving. Men have fewer, errands and disguises. Hatherley's makes excellent hat boxes with very stiff sides. They will hold more than hats. I should like very much to know who in Bramble Halt has a new hat from Hatherley's and is not wearing it. Harriet blinked. But how will you? I shall not do anything at all, Miss Marple said cheerfully. I shall sit here very quietly and knit until the wool makes a tangle, and someone will come to me in a little anxiety about nothing at all. People always do. She bent, as if to pick up a dropped stitch, and felt beneath her fingers a faint dusting of powder on the bench slat. A little pale smear like chalk. Children had been playing there earlier, she remembered, with a skipping rope. The rope had left a white trace on their hands, which they then transferred to the bench when they sat, laughing, to rest. Do you know, Harriet, she said, it occurs to me that ropes leave marks in more places than one. Harriet looked at her in a confusion of concern and awe. You frighten me sometimes, Jane. Nonsense, Miss Marple said. I am only an old lady thinking about hats. She rose with that neat energy of small, self-contained people and looked toward the lane. The sun had shifted and drew a brighter band along the road that led to Much Hamilton. She saw far off the figure of Reverend Phelps walking quickly, his head down, his hands clasped behind his back, like a man reciting something to himself. The curate did not look once at his watch now. He moved as if, now that the hour had come, he must keep pace. And perhaps, Miss Marple added, almost to herself, about who was meant to take the last train and who, after all, did. The following morning brought with it a low, persistent mist that clung to the hedgerows and blurred the familiar outlines of Bramble Halt. It was the kind of damp, curling fog that seemed to press sound downward, so that the distant whistle of the morning train arrived as a muffled note, rather than the usual crisp call. In the high street, shopkeepers went about their opening routines with an air of subdued interest in each other's business, while customers lingered longer than necessary over purchases in order to exchange the latest additions to the tale of the murdered man on the last train. At Mrs. Finch's breakfast table, Miss Marple sat quietly buttering toast, while Harriet recounted the prevailing theories. Mrs. Rowcroft says it was a robbery gone wrong. Of course, she doesn't say what was robbed, or how, or why the fellow would have been robbed in a train compartment in the middle of the night. Mr. Ford from the Fida Grocers believes it was a political matter. Says he's read in the papers that such things happen abroad, and now we'll have them here. And young Ivy Cooper insists she saw a sinister gentleman hanging about the station the evening before, which I am sure is her way of making herself sound important to Mr. Briggs at the bakery. Harriet paused for a sip of tea. And the truth is, Jane, that everyone has an idea, and most of them have nothing to do with the facts. Miss Marple spread her marmalade with delicate precision. People often speak with confidence about things they do not know, my dear. It gives a pleasant sense of being useful without the trouble of being correct. She set her knife down neatly. Tell me, Harriet, what is Inspector Graves's opinion of Mr. Brooks? Oh, Lionel? Harriet looked surprised. Why? I should think he considers him an unimportant witness, someone who happened to be on the train but knows nothing. Lionel says he didn't see Mr. Colston at all, and I suppose that's possible. Possible, Miss Marple agreed. But one must remember that in a village such as ours, people's movements are often better known than they believe. For instance, Mrs. Partridge remarked to me, quite unprompted, that she saw Lionel walking away from the station after the last train. She thought nothing of it at the time, but she did notice he was carrying nothing at all. Which is curious, because Lionel went to town that day with a briefcase. Harriet frowned. Perhaps he left it at his office. Perhaps, Miss Marple said mildly, though her tone carried a weight that suggested she thought it no such thing. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Inspector Graves himself, removing his hat as Harriet ushered him into the small sitting room. He declined tea. "I've already had 3 cups this morning, and a man must keep his wits," and sat forward in his chair with a notebook balanced on one knee. "I thought I'd better give you the latest," he said. "We've confirmed Mr. Colston's identity through the address in his case. He was staying at a small hotel in London. Business of some kind, involving shipping. No wife, no family that we've found yet. The hotel clerk remembers him leaving yesterday afternoon with that same small leather case and the green hat box. We've also spoken to Hatherleys. They sold a hat in that box yesterday morning to a lady. Paid in cash, gave no name. The hat was a dark cloche, rather smart. But they say the lady seemed more interested in the box than the hat itself. And they can't describe her very well. Average height, face half hidden by a veil." Miss Marple's eyes took on that look Harriet knew well, attentive without appearing so. A veil is a useful thing, Inspector. It gives the impression of refinement while concealing what one wishes hidden. And if the lady cared more for the box than for the hat, then the hat was either a pretext or a cover for something else. "Exactly," Graves said. "Now, about the train. The conductor recalls seeing Mr. Colston board at Much Hamilton with a gentleman he didn't recognize. They sat together for a while, quiet talk. But when the conductor came back along the corridor, only Mr. Colston was there. The other fellow must have moved to another carriage. Trouble is, we can't find anyone who admits to being that man, and no one remembers seeing the hat box after they left Much Hamilton." Miss Marple folded her hands. "It is remarkable how easily an object can pass unnoticed if it is placed in the right hands. People observe faces, not possessions, unless, of course, the object is out of place, like a lady's hat box in a man's care. But if the box passed to a lady at Much Hamilton, no one would think twice. Which brings us," Graves said, "to the question of who that lady might be. There aren't so many in Bramble Halt who shop at Hatherley's. Mrs. Partridge does, but she hasn't been to town for weeks. Clarissa Rowcroft might, but she claims she was unwell yesterday evening." "And Reverend Phelps?" Miss Marple inquired, almost idly. Graves looked faintly puzzled. "The curate? I can't see him in Hatherley's millinery." "No, but a gentleman can purchase a hat box for a lady," Miss Marple said gently. "And the Reverend is a most dutiful young man. It would not be unusual for him to run an errand on someone's behalf, especially if it were for a lady in the parish whom he wished to oblige." Graves made a small note in his book, though his expression remained non-committal. "I'll make inquiries," he said. Then, as though changing the subject, "We're arranging to speak to the passengers from the last train. Some have been difficult to trace. If you happen to hear anything—" "I shall remember," Miss Marple said. After he had gone, Harriet turned to her friend with a mixture of curiosity and unease. Jane, do you really think the curate? My dear, Miss Marple interrupted kindly, I think nothing without evidence. But I do observe that the Reverend has been distracted of late, and that distraction in a man of his habits is usually connected to something personal rather than ecclesiastical. It may be entirely innocent. Still, she took up her knitting and counted stitches. One keeps an open mind. Later that morning, Miss Marple took a slow walk through the village. She paused at the post office under the pretense of purchasing stamps, which gave her the opportunity to speak with Mrs. Larkin, who knew more of the village comings and goings than anyone. Mrs. Larkin confirmed that Lionel Brooks had sent a telegram the previous evening, though to whom she could not say. In a bit of a rush, he was, and wouldn't even wait for change. Said he had somewhere to be. Funny thing, though, he didn't go towards his home. Went back in the direction of the station. This small piece of information slid neatly into Miss Marple's mental arrangement of the case. Lionel's late-night errand to the station after sending a telegram, was it coincidence? And if he had been on the train with Mr. Colston, had they crossed paths, or had Lionel avoided him deliberately? She left the post office and made her way to the churchyard, where the mist was lifting enough to show Reverend Phelps kneeling beside a newly planted row of roses. He looked up at her approach, wiping soil from his hands. "Miss Marple," he said, "a sad business, this affair with the train." "I suppose the whole village is talking." "They are," she agreed. "Such events bring out the natural curiosity in people. And yet I find myself wondering why you looked at your watch so often yesterday afternoon, when you already knew the time." The curate blinked, his polite expression tightening. "I suppose I was anxious not to be late for an appointment later in the evening." "A parish call?" He hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Something of the sort." Miss Marple nodded as though satisfied. But as she left him, she reflected that his answer had been too carefully vague. She did not press him further. People were far more inclined to speak when they felt their explanations had been accepted. By early afternoon, the fog had burned away, and the sound of the incoming train carried clearly on the air. Miss Marple found herself back near the station, where Inspector Graves was supervising a search of the sidings. He beckoned her over. "Something interesting," he said, leading her to a small storage shed. Inside, propped against a wall, was a green hat box. The label from Hatherley's had been torn off, and the box was empty. "Found it tucked behind some crates this morning. Whoever left it there didn't want it found straight away." Miss Marple examined it without touching. "No dust," she observed. "So it hasn't been here long. And the tear in the label is quite clean, done with a sharp blade, not torn by hand. That speaks of intention. Was it locked?" "Number. But there are faint marks on the lining. Could have held something with metal edges. My guess is papers or perhaps a small case inside. Whatever it was, it's gone now." "Then the box has served its purpose," Miss Marple said. "And the person who left it here believes that without its contents, it has no value." She looked at him thoughtfully. "But sometimes the shell tells you as much as the nut it once held." Graves regarded her with narrowed eyes. "You think I should be looking at who could have hidden it here rather than what was in it?" "I think both will lead you to the same door," she replied. "But the door will be easier to find." As she walked back towards Mrs. Finch's cottage, Miss Marple turned over the matter in her mind. A murdered man, a missing object from a hat box, Lionel's unexplained movements, the curate's appointment, Clarissa's convenient headache, all threads in a pattern not yet complete. But she knew that patterns reveal themselves not by pulling at them, but by letting them settle until the design shows through. And so, when she reached the cottage garden, she sat in her chair by the window, took up her knitting, and waited, knowing, as she always did, that sooner or later, someone would bring her the missing stitch. The evening sun cast a soft amber glow over Bramble Halt, the kind that made even the most ordinary of cottages look like something out of an old watercolor. Yet there was nothing serene about the undercurrent running through the village that night. In the snug bar of the King's Arms, where the smell of ale and pipe tobacco hung comfortably in the air, conversation swirled in low voices. The regulars leaned in close over their pints, speaking in the way people do when the subject is both too dreadful to ignore and too delicious to share loudly. Miss Marple had no reason, outwardly, to be at the King's Arms. She rarely took anything stronger than tea. But Mrs. Finch, claiming her store cupboard was in want of a certain brand of chutney only sold at the pub's small provisions counter, had persuaded her friend to accompany her. Harriet, of course, believed she was doing the persuading. In reality, Miss Marple had been turning over in her mind the fact that pubs are excellent places to hear half-conversations, the kind that reveal more in their omissions than their statements. As they stepped inside, the hum of voices dipped and then resumed. Behind the bar, Mr. Tewson nodded politely. "Evening, ladies. Chutney's in the back, Mrs. Finch. I'll fetch it." While Harriet discussed jars and quantities, Miss Marple took a slow survey of the room. Lionel Brooks sat at a corner table with a man she didn't recognize. Tall, narrow-faced, wearing a coat that looked too warm for the season. They bent their heads together in a conversation that paused when Lionel noticed Miss Marple's gaze. He smiled, but the other man did not. At a table near the window, Clarissa Rowcroft sat with her back very straight, speaking to Reverend Phelps. Her hands were folded in her lap, her head inclined just enough to suggest attentiveness, yet her eyes flicked once toward Lionel's table. Miss Marple's attention returned to the bar as Mr. Tewson handed Harriet her jar. "Business about the train," he said, lowering his voice. "Odd goings-on at the station last night, from what I hear." "I should think so," Harriet replied with emphasis. "A man murdered. One can hardly call it ordinary." Tewson glanced over his shoulder. "More than that, someone was hanging about the yard after the last train. Couldn't see who, but they went off toward the old coal shed. Haven't seen it used in years." He shook his head. "Wouldn't surprise me if it had something to do with that hat box they found." Miss Marple made a small sound of agreement, as though such a thing were no more than a curiosity. But the image of the disused coal shed settled neatly alongside the hat box in her mind. Objects don't vanish into thin air. They travel from one hiding place to another, often guided by the simplest of hands. She and Harriet left shortly after, passing Lionel on the way out. "Miss Marple," he said pleasantly, "you should let me walk you home. It's getting on to dusk." "That is very kind," she replied. "But Harriet and I have our route. I expect you have your own way to go." She held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary, and something flickered there. Annoyance quickly smoothed away. As they turned down the lane, Harriet said, "Jane, why do you make a point of declining perfectly good offers from young men?" "My dear, if one wishes to observe where a person goes, it is better not to have them walking at one's side," Miss Marple said. And indeed, a glance over her shoulder showed Lionel and his companion leaving the pub by the side door, heading not toward the high street, but in the direction of the station yard. The next morning dawned bright, the mist gone and the air sharp. Inspector Graves arrived at Mrs. Finch's just after breakfast, his coat unbuttoned and a faint streak of dust on one sleeve. "We've searched the coal shed," he said without preamble. "Nothing there now but some old crates and a pile of broken chairs. But there's a footprint in the dust. Men's size 8, I'd say. And here's the thing. 2 distinct tread patterns. One's the main shoe, the other looks like a patch or repair on the heel. That's the sort of detail a cobbler might remember." Miss Marple set down her teacup. "Then perhaps you might speak to Mr. Hollis. He knows every shoe in the village, and most from outside it, too. He mends for the next parish as well." "I've sent a man," Graves said. "Meanwhile, there's news from London. Colston had been in correspondence with a certain legal firm about a contested inheritance, a considerable sum if the papers are right. Seems he was due to meet someone yesterday evening to exchange documents. And those documents, Miss Marple, could have fit neatly into a hatbox." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "So the meeting was likely at Much Hamilton, which would explain the waiting, the glances toward the door, the remark overheard by that nice girl at the refreshment room. And if he handed over the hatbox, perhaps in exchange for something promised, then he boarded the train expecting to see that arrangement concluded later. But instead," she let the thought trail off. "Instead," Graves said grimly, "someone decided there was more profit in murder." Harriet shuddered. "But who would do such a thing in Bramble Halt?" "People are much the same everywhere, my dear," Miss Marple said softly. "The setting merely changes the view." By mid-afternoon, Mr. Hollis the cobbler had provided his contribution. The patched heel, he declared, belonged to a pair of shoes he had mended for Lionel Brooks only last month. Graves's jaw tightened at the news. When confronted, Lionel was all bright indignation. "Yes, I've been to the coal shed. It's a shortcut to the back road when I don't want to be seen crossing the yard. Is that a crime? I met a friend there last night to discuss a business opportunity. Nothing whatsoever to do with your dead man." "And the hatbox?" Graves asked. "What hatbox?" Lionel's brows drew together in a frown of theatrical confusion. "I haven't the faintest idea what you mean." Graves dismissed him with a warning and turned to Miss Marple afterwards. "He's lying. Question is, about what part?" "Perhaps all of it," Miss Marple said, "or perhaps only enough to make the truth impossible to separate from the lie. That is a common tactic among the guilty and the frightened." That evening, as Miss Marple sat by the fire with her knitting, Harriet read aloud from the local paper's account of the murder. There was little new in it, save for one small paragraph noting that the Reverend Phelps had traveled unexpectedly to Much Hamilton 2 days prior, on parish business. "Curious," Miss Marple murmured. "What is?" Harriet asked. "That a curate should have parish business in Much Hamilton when his own parish keeps him more than occupied. And that such business should not have been mentioned to the vicar. Or so I am given to understand." She slipped her needles back into the wool. "It may be nothing. But then again, in my experience, parish business is a phrase that covers a multitude of sins." Harriet set the paper aside, looking faintly alarmed. "Jane, are you saying the curate might be mixed up in this?" "I am saying only that people sometimes find themselves in difficulties not of their own making, and then do foolish things in the hope of setting them right. The trouble is that foolishness, like spilled ink, spreads further than intended." The next day promised to be one of quiet watching. But Miss Marple had already decided she would take the morning train to Much Hamilton, not to call it Hatherley's, as Graves's constable had already done, but to visit the refreshment room and see if Lillian Drew remembered any other detail about Mr. Colston's meeting. People, she knew, often recall the smallest things when they are given time, and the sense that such things are of no importance at all. And somewhere, between a green hat box, a coal shed, and the patched heel of a shoe, the truth of the last train to Bramble Halt waited to be found. The 10:15 to Much Hamilton rattled along the line with its usual mix of half-empty compartments and the faint smell of coal smoke that clung even to the first-class upholstery. Miss Marple sat near the window, the countryside rolling by, in soft greens and golds, her knitting bag on the seat beside her. She was not knitting this morning. Instead, she appeared to be absorbed in the scenery, though in truth her thoughts were fixed upon what she hoped to learn at the other end of the line. The refreshment room at Much Hamilton Station was doing modest trade when she arrived. A few travelers were sipping tea, a porter was having a sandwich at the counter, and behind it stood Lillian Drew, the young woman who had spoken to her earlier. Lillian's face brightened with recognition. "Good morning, Miss Marple. You've come up to see the shops?" "Not quite, my dear," Miss Marple said, leaning in with a kindly smile. "I was hoping you might indulge me in a few more of your recollections about Mr. Colston's visit here. You see, sometimes the smallest thing, quite unimportant at the time, turns out to be the key." Lillian thought for a moment, wiping her hands on her apron. "Well, I told you he was waiting for someone. I didn't see them meet, but now that I think of it, there was a lady came in just before he went out to the platform. Dark coat, little veil. She didn't buy anything, just stood near the door as if she were looking out for someone. I thought she was waiting for the train. She left about a minute before he did." Miss Marple nodded, encouraging her to continue. "Oh, and she had gloves on," Lillian added. "Not unusual, I suppose, but she kept them on the whole time, even though it wasn't that cold. And when she turned to go, I noticed her shoes. They had very high heels, sharp ones. I remember thinking they'd be awkward on the platform grating." This, Miss Marple filed away neatly. High heels, gloves, a veil, a meeting in which nothing was purchased and a hat box exchanged hands. She thanked Lillian warmly and took a slow turn about the station before boarding the return train. At Bramble Halt, Inspector Graves was waiting on the platform. "I've been looking for you," he said without preamble. "We've had a bit of movement. Mr. Hollis has confirmed Lionel's patched heel, and we've also had word from Hatherley's that a second green hat box was purchased the day before the murder by a Mrs. Emilia Rowcroft." Miss Marple's brows lifted. "Mrs. Rowcroft? How very coincidental. She says it was for her niece Clarissa. Claims it's still at the house, hat and all. We'll be having a look." But that's not all. Our constable at the coal shed found a scrap of brown paper with part of a London hotel's name on it. Matches the one Colston stayed at. Miss Marple allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Then, whatever was in the hat box did indeed come from him. The question, Inspector, is who received it, and why it was worth a man's life. They walked together toward Mrs. Rowcroft's fine, white-fronted house. Clarissa met them at the door, her poise as careful as ever. "Aunt is resting," she said. "But if you wish to see the hat box, it's in my room, quite untouched." The box was there, green and pristine, resting on a dressing table. Inside lay a dark plush hat, tissue paper neatly arranged. Graves examined it with a practiced hand, but there was nothing to suggest it had ever held anything else. "You see," Clarissa said sweetly, "I hardly think a hat could be dangerous, Inspector. Some hats have caused more trouble than you'd believe." Miss Marple murmured, inspecting the box's lining. "A very fine box, my dear. You must take care of it." On their way out, Graves muttered, "If she's lying, she's good at it. But the hat's genuine enough." "Which may mean," Miss Marple said, "that there were 2 hat boxes in circulation, and that the confusion between them has been quite deliberate." That afternoon, Harriet brought news from her morning errands. "Jane, you'll never guess. Mrs. Partridge has been telling anyone who will listen that she saw the curate at Much Hamilton the day before the murder. And he wasn't alone. She says he was walking with a young lady in a dark coat and veil." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. "And does she describe this young lady's shoes?" "No," Harriet admitted. "Why?" "Because high heels on a station platform suggest someone who is not accustomed to railway travel or who wishes to make a certain impression. Our curate's companions are usually of a more sensible persuasion, which leads one to wonder whether the lady was in fact from here or from somewhere else entirely." By evening, another small piece of the puzzle arrived, carried in the form of a note from Inspector Graves. It read, "Hatbox lining from Cole's shed shows faint traces of graphite, possibly from pencils or carbon paper." Miss Marple read it twice, her mind drifting to the inheritance dispute Graves had mentioned. Graphite suggested documents, perhaps copies of legal papers. Such things could be transported easily inside a hatbox, exchanged without drawing the eye. And if the recipient wished to keep them hidden, a disused shed would be a convenient interim hiding place. After supper, Miss Marple took a slow walk toward the station. The platform was quiet, the lamps casting long, thin shadows. She paused at the far end, near the siding where the last carriage often rested. There she saw a figure, slender in a dark coat, slipping from the direction of the coal shed toward the lane. The steps were quick, the heels tapping softly against the wood. She did not follow. She did not need to. The sound was enough. And she knew, from Lillian's memory and Harriet's gossip, that those steps had been heard before. When she returned home, Harriet looked up from her embroidery. "Did you see anything, Jane?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Only that some shoes carry a person further than they mean to go, and sometimes straight into trouble." That night, in her neat bedroom, she laid out the threads in her mind. Colston comes to Much Hamilton to meet a lady. He hands her a hatbox, possibly containing legal documents. The lady leaves before him. He boards the train alone. Someone else enters his compartment before Bramble Halt, using the bell cord to kill him. The hatbox turns up empty in a coal shed, with Lionel's patched heel nearby. Mrs. Rowcroft owns a second hatbox of the same make. The curate is seen in Much Hamilton with a veiled lady. High heels, gloves, and a deliberate concealment of identity. It was not yet the whole picture, but already the outlines of the design were clear. And if she were correct, one of Bramble Halt's most respectable faces was wearing a very different mask indeed. Miss Marple closed her eyes and allowed herself a few moments' rest. The next day would bring its own opportunities, and she meant to be ready when the right person began, quite innocently, to talk. For in her experience, it was often not the asking of questions, but the listening to unguarded answers that solved a murder. The morning broke crisp and clear, the kind of September day when the air feels newly washed, and the light falls in such a way that even the smallest details stand out sharply. From her seat by Mrs. Finch's front window, Miss Marple could see the delivery cart making its slow way up the high street, the driver stopping to pass a word with nearly everyone he met. Such little pauses, she reflected, were the arteries through which news and rumor flowed most freely in a place like Bramble Halt. Harriet, bustling in with the breakfast tray, was already full of the latest whispers. Apparently, she began without preamble, Inspector Graves was seen speaking very earnestly to Mrs. Rowcroft outside the post office yesterday afternoon. Mrs. Pratt says they were at it for a good 5 minutes, and Mrs. Rowcroft looked quite flustered. Mrs. Pratt is certain it was about Clarissa. Miss Marple poured her tea with careful steadiness. Mrs. Pratt, she said, is a woman who can interpret a thunderstorm as a personal message if she puts her mind to it. Still, if Mrs. Rowcroft looked flustered, that is worth noting. The very well-bred often pride themselves on remaining composed in public. Harriet sat down, lowering her voice. And there's more. Mrs. Partridge says the curate was seen leaving the vicarage late last night, close to 11 o'clock, and heading toward the station road. That's unusual, isn't it? It is unusual for a man of such regular habits, Miss Marple agreed, especially when there was no late train to take. The station road leads to other places, of course, including the coal shed. Harriet's eyes widened. Do you think he— My dear, Miss Marple interrupted gently, I think it is quite possible that he has been tasked with an errand. Whether he knows its true nature is another matter. She set down her cup. Perhaps we might take a walk after breakfast. The weather is so very fine. They set out 20 minutes later, taking the long way round toward the station. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke from early fires, and somewhere a dog barked lazily. As they neared the yard, Miss Marple slowed. The coal shed stood where it always had, hunched in its corner like a disreputable relative, the door hanging slightly ajar. She made no move to go closer, but her eyes took in the marks on the ground, the scuff of a man's shoe, a faint indentation as though something box-shaped had been set down and lifted again. Inspector Graves emerged from the station office just then, his expression that of a man juggling too many facts and too few certainties. Miss Marple, he greeted, you have a knack for appearing when something's afoot. The station porter swears he heard voices in the yard last night, a man and a woman. Couldn't make out words, but one voice, he's sure, was that of the curate. Interesting, Miss Marple said mildly, especially as Mrs. Partridge places him on the same road at the same time. Confirmation is always useful. She looked toward the shed. Have you considered that the coal shed may not be the final hiding place? Sometimes the simplest decoy is to leave an empty hiding place in plain sight, while the real object is elsewhere. Graves's brows drew together. Are you suggesting the hatbox was moved again? I am suggesting, Miss Marple replied, that the person who placed it there may have intended someone else to find it. Someone who would then believe they had the whole of it, when in fact they did not. Graves let out a breath. That's a complication I could do without. Still, you may be right. Hollis has given me the name of another customer with patched heels, Mrs. Rowcroft's gardener. But he hasn't been near the station in weeks, so far as we know. Gardens, Miss Marple said, are like people's lives. They hold traces of what has been buried and sometimes bring it to the surface. She gave him a small, knowing look. Perhaps you might take a stroll past Mrs. Rowcroft's roses. By the time she and Harriet returned home, the village was already stirring with new threads of speculation. Clarissa had been seen walking with Lionel in the lane by the mill, deep in conversation, according to Mrs. Pratt's cousin. And at the baker's, the talk was that the curate had been to Much Hamilton twice in the past week. Most irregular for a man whose duties were firmly rooted here. Miss Marple spent the afternoon quietly in the garden, trimming a few stray branches and appearing entirely absorbed in her plants. In reality, she was thinking about patterns. Lionel's patched heel by the coal shed, the veiled lady in much Hamilton with high heels and gloves, the curate's unexplained evening errand, Mrs. Rowcroft's second hat box, so obligingly complete with its hat, and over it all, the sense that someone had planned for the confusion to divide suspicion neatly among several people, none of whom could be accused without uncertainty. Just before 4, Clarissa Rowcroft appeared at the gate. She was dressed with the calculated casualness of someone expecting to be seen. A soft cardigan over a silk blouse, the brim of her hat casting her face into becoming shadow. "Miss Marple," she began, "I was wondering if I might trouble you for your advice. Aunt has been so upset by all this unpleasantness, and I think a small charity bazaar might take her mind off it. Do you think the villagers would be in the mood for such a thing?" "It is surprising," Miss Marple said pleasantly, "how often people welcome distraction when they are unsettled. It allows them to appear engaged in something entirely harmless while their thoughts are elsewhere." Clarissa gave a small, practiced laugh. "You do have a way of putting things. Well, I suppose it can't hurt to try." She glanced toward the house. "Is Mrs. Finch in?" "She is upstairs resting, but you may leave any message with me." Clarissa hesitated. "It's nothing important. Just, if you see Lionel, tell him I've found what he asked about, and we can discuss it later, at the usual place." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Of course, my dear." After Clarissa had gone, Harriet came down, puzzled. What did she want? "Oh, nothing of consequence," Miss Marple said, "except to confirm that she and Lionel have a usual place for meeting, and that she is in possession of something he wanted, which, given our present circumstances, is quite a large nothing indeed." That evening, as dusk drew in, Miss Marple took another turn toward the station yard, purely by chance, or so it would appear to anyone watching. Near the hedge she paused, stooping as if to adjust her shoe. In the soft earth, half concealed by fallen leaves, was the clear imprint of a woman's high-heeled shoe. The sharp point of the heel had driven into the soil, leaving a neat little hole. She straightened slowly, her mind ticking over. The pattern was holding: Lionel near the coal shed, the curate's presence in the yard, Clarissa's high-heeled visitor in much Hamilton, and now the matching footprint here in Bramble Halt. When she reached home, Inspector Graves was waiting, his expression both grim and tired. "We've just had word from London," he said. "Colston's papers were copies of a will, leaving a considerable estate to a young woman, name withheld in the correspondence. The original will's in dispute, and whoever holds these copies could make quite a difference in court." "Then," Miss Marple said quietly, "the value of what was in the hat box is now beyond doubt. The question, Inspector, is whether the lady beneficiary knew she was in danger the moment she accepted them, or whether someone else took care to relieve her of the responsibility." Graves nodded. "And by took care, you mean?" "I mean," Miss Marple said, "that someone decided it was safer for themselves if Mr. Colston never reached his destination alive." She paused, her eyes very bright in the lamplight. "But you see, Inspector, once you know who had reason to want the will suppressed, and who had the means to exchange the hat box, the path becomes very narrow indeed." "Almost as narrow," she added, "as the heel mark of a shoe in the damp earth." Graves looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing whether to press for more. But Miss Marple merely smiled, folded her hands, and waited. For in her mind, the final shape of the thing was beginning to emerge, though there were still 1 or 2 small stitches to set before the pattern could be declared complete. The next morning brought with it a brittle sort of sunshine. Bright, but with an edge that hinted at the turning of the season. The air in Bramble Halt felt clearer, sharper, and in that clarity, Miss Marple sensed the investigation was reaching a point where the smallest movement might unsettle the whole arrangement of lies and half-truths that had been so carefully laid. She took her breakfast quietly, listening to Harriet speak of the latest social ripples the murder had caused. Mrs. Pratt, of course, had raised the matter at the Women's Institute meeting, declaring that no one is safe with strange men taking the late train. Mrs. Partridge countered with a thinly veiled remark about people one thinks one knows, who may be quite different in reality, which had set half the room glancing sideways at Clarissa Rowcroft. Harriet, who had been there to witness it, described the scene with relish. Clarissa took it well, Harriet said, buttering her toast. Smiled and asked after Mrs. Partridge's roses. But you could see she didn't like it. I dare say she'll keep her head down for a bit. Miss Marple stirred her tea. Possibly, or possibly she will move more quickly before suspicion settles too firmly. It depends on her nature. Some people, when cornered, wait. Others step forward at once in the hope of moving the danger elsewhere. Harriet frowned. Do you think she's... I think she is part of a pattern, Miss Marple said. And patterns, once begun, tend to continue unless something interrupts them. After breakfast, Miss Marple decided on a short walk to the post office, a place where news could be overheard without appearing to seek it. The bell above the door tinkled as she entered. Mrs. Larkin was at the counter, her hands busy with parcels, but her ears clearly attuned to the conversation of two customers by the telegram desk. And he said he'd be there at 8:30 sharp, one of the men was saying. Same place as before. Didn't say what for, mind you. The other chuckled. If it's about that business in Much Hamilton, I wouldn't touch it. Not after what happened on that train. Miss Marple bought her stamps with a pleasant word to Mrs. Larkin, and when she stepped back into the sunshine, she tucked the overheard time and phrase away. 8:30. Same place as before. There were very few places in Bramble Halt that served as convenient, discreet meeting spots, and only one she could think of that matched the events of the past days. The coal shed. By late afternoon, Inspector Graves called in, clearly pressed for time. We've got another development, he said, lowering his voice. A guard on the Much Hamilton platform came forward. He remembers seeing a gentleman and a lady together, standing near the last carriage before departure. The man was carrying a small case, the lady had a green hat box. When the train left, only the man boarded. The lady turned back toward the station building. He swears she wasn't on the train at all. That, Miss Marple said mildly, fits very neatly with what young Lillian at the refreshment room observed. The lady did not intend to travel. She came only to receive, or to pass, something. Graves nodded grimly, and if the something was the will papers, then she may have given them straight to someone else, which could mean the killing happened for no purpose at all. Colston may have been empty-handed by the time the murderer struck. Not quite empty-handed, Miss Marple said. A man who has just given away something valuable may still be dangerous if he knows too much about the person who received it. That evening, as dusk crept across the village, Miss Marple prepared herself for a small outing. She told Harriet she meant to take a turn in the cooler air before bed, and Harriet, used to her friend's occasional solitary walks, made no objection. The air was still, the lamplight warm against the encroaching blue of night. She took the long way to the station yard, keeping to the shadows along the hedge. At 8:20, The place was empty save for the faint creak of the coal shed door in the light breeze. At 8:30 exactly, a figure approached from the far side. Lionel Brooks, his stride confident, his hands in his coat pockets. He glanced around once, then leaned casually against the shed. Moments later, another figure appeared. It was Clarissa Rowcroft. Wearing the same dark coat Miss Marple had heard described, though without the veil. Even in the dim light, Miss Marple noticed her shoes, the high, sharp heels that had left their mark in the yard. Clarissa held a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "You're late," Lionel said, his tone curt. "I had to make sure I wasn't followed," Clarissa replied. "This is what you wanted." She handed him the parcel. Lionel took it, but instead of looking relieved, he frowned. "This isn't all of it." "It's all I could get," she said quickly. "You know who has the rest." Lionel's gaze hardened. "Then you'd better get it from them before the inspector does." Their voices dropped lower after that, too low for Miss Marple to catch the words. But the posture between them was clear enough. Not a romantic tryst, but the strained exchange of two people bound by something risky and unfinished. After a few minutes, they parted in opposite directions. Clarissa toward the high street, Lionel toward the back road. Miss Marple remained in the shadows a moment longer, then turned back herself. She had no wish to confront them, not yet. It was enough to have seen the meeting. She suspected Graves would be very interested to learn of it, though she also suspected that telling him too soon might drive the quarry deeper into cover. Timing in such matters was everything. The next day, Bramble Halt hummed with fresh undercurrents. Word had got round, though no one seemed to know the source, that Inspector Graves had strong leads and expected developments any day. This sort of talk often made the guilty either bolder or more nervous, and Miss Marple kept a discreet eye on both Lionel and Clarissa. Lionel appeared at the grocer's buying cigarettes, but his conversation was distracted. Clarissa was seen walking to the vicarage in the early afternoon, staying only a few minutes before leaving again. Late in the day, Graves arrived at Mrs. Finch's with a question. "What do you make of this, Miss Marple?" he asked, placing on the table a small scrap of paper. On it was a list of names, including Colston's, with a few initials beside each and a series of numbers. "It looks," Miss Marple said, "very much like the sort of index a solicitor might keep. Names of interested parties, perhaps, in a legal matter. The numbers could be references to case files. Found it in the lining of a coat we took from the coal shed," Graves said. "Men's coat. Not Lionel's, too large for him. No label, but there was a faint smell of pipe tobacco." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Pipe tobacco, that narrows our field. There are only a handful of men here who smoke a pipe, and fewer still who would leave a coat in so out-of-the-way a place." Graves leaned in. "You have someone in mind?" "I have several," she said. "But I should like to be certain. Sometimes the coat a man leaves behind tells you more than the one he wears in public." That evening, she sat by the fire with her knitting, turning over the picture in her mind. The pieces were settling. The lady in Much Hamilton who never boarded the train, the hat box that changed hands twice, Lionel's patched heel by the shed, Clarissa's parcel, the curate's late-night errand, and now a pipe smoker's coat with a solicitor's list hidden in its lining. It was, she thought, rather like one of those old patchwork quilts she had seen in the vicarage attic years ago. At first, only a jumble of scraps, but gradually revealing a deliberate design. And she was very nearly ready to see that design in full. All that remained was to watch, very closely, for the moment when one of the players in this quiet drama betrayed, in word or deed, the final link between the murder on the last train and the life they were so determined to keep hidden. She smiled to herself, setting another neat row of stitches. People, she knew, rarely noticed when an old lady was simply there, and that was the best vantage point in the world when one was waiting for the truth to arrive, as it always did, right on time. The following day dawned with a light wind that carried the scent of damp earth and early wood smoke through Bramble Halt. It was the sort of morning that made the village appear almost innocent again, as if murder could be tucked neatly away, like a bad dream. Yet Miss Marple knew better. Crimes, she reflected, had a way of lingering in the very air, the way the faint scent of lavender might remain long after a dress had been put away in the wardrobe. After breakfast, Harriet announced she would be visiting Mrs. Partridge to discuss the Women's Institute charity stall, which left Miss Marple conveniently free to pursue her own quiet inquiries. She began with a leisurely walk along the high street, exchanging greetings with the shopkeepers and pausing here and there in doorways long enough to overhear the rhythm of conversation without intruding. By the time she reached the post office, the threads of gossip were unusually lively. Mrs. Larkin, bustling behind the counter, nodded in greeting but could not resist passing on a snippet. "They say Inspector Graves has been in and out of the vicarage twice this morning," she murmured, "and Mr. Phelps, the curate, looked pale as milk when he came out the last time." Miss Marple received this with a mild lift of the eyebrows and purchased a packet of notepaper she didn't strictly need. She was not surprised to hear of the inspector's interest in the curate. The late-night errand toward the station, coupled with Mrs. Partridge's sighting of him in Much Hamilton with a veiled lady, was not the sort of coincidence Graves was likely to overlook. From the post office, she took the lane toward the churchyard. The Reverend Phelps was there, clipping dead blooms from a row of chrysanthemums, his expression studiously calm. He started slightly when he noticed her. "Miss Marple," he said, managing a polite smile. "A fine morning, isn't it?" "Very fine," she agreed, pausing beside the low stone wall. "I hear you have had a busy day already." The faintest color touched his cheeks. "Oh? Well, yes. Inspector Graves had a few questions. Routine, I'm sure." "Routine is a comfort," Miss Marple said gently, "though I always find it interesting when routine leads one to the station yard after dark." His hands tightened slightly on the clippers. "I was delivering something for a parishioner," he said after a moment. "Private business. Nothing to do with that terrible affair on the train." Miss Marple nodded as if satisfied, though her mind filed away his choice of words. Private business. The curate was not lying easily. She had seen that look before, on younger men in St. Mary Mead, who had found themselves entangled in other people's secrets. Leaving him to his chrysanthemums, she walked on toward Mrs. Rowcroft's. She had no intention of calling, but the front gate afforded a good view of the garden. As she had suggested to Inspector Graves, gardens could reveal much about what people buried, both literally and figuratively. Near the side wall, where the gardener had recently turned over the soil, she saw the corner of a waxed paper envelope protruding from the earth. She did not step inside to retrieve it. Trespassing was a poor habit to form, but she noted its position carefully before walking on. By early afternoon, Graves himself appeared at Mrs. Finch's cottage. He looked tired but purposeful, and carried under his arm a small brown paper-wrapped bundle. "Thought you might like to see this," he said, unwrapping it on the table. Inside was the green hat box from the coal shed. "We've gone over it again. Found a few faint smudges inside. Graphite dust, like before. But also a hairpin wedged under the lining. Plain black, cheap." Miss Marple regarded it with interest. A useful clue, Inspector, though not always for the reason one might think. Such pins are so common that one could argue they belong to half the women in the county. But she tilted her head. This one has a slight bend to it, as though it had been twisted in haste. That suggests it was lost while being removed quickly, perhaps to take off a hat in a hurry. Graves made a note. We're tracing the hairpin as best we can, and we've spoken again to the porter who heard voices in the yard. He now thinks the woman's voice might have been Clarissa Rowcroft's. Not certain, but the tone and pitch, he says, seemed right. That would be consistent with what I observed, Miss Marple said. Clarissa met Lionel at the shed the other night and passed him a parcel. If she also visited the shed earlier, perhaps to move or check on the hatbox, then the porter may indeed have heard her. Graves frowned. And Lionel's story still doesn't hold. He claims he hasn't been near the shed in weeks, but we've got his patched heel print there. People often tell the truth in parts, Miss Marple said, hoping the omissions will pass unnoticed. It is a form of self-preservation, dangerous because it tends to unravel when pressed. When Graves left, she sat quietly for a time, knitting in the stillness of the afternoon. Her thoughts were turning toward the will Colston had been carrying, copies of it at least, and the mystery of the unnamed young woman who stood to benefit. If that beneficiary were someone local, the motive for keeping the will hidden became clear enough. Money in the wrong hands can be as dangerous as any weapon. Shortly before dusk, Miss Marple made her way to the grocer's. As she passed the narrow alley beside the shop, she heard voices, a man's low and urgent, a woman's sharper and defensive. Told you I'd do what I could, the woman was saying, but I can't just walk into her house and take it. You managed it before, came the man's reply. And if you don't, well, you know what happens if the inspector gets there first. Miss Marple kept walking, not turning her head. But the timbre of the voices was enough. Lionel and Clarissa again. So the parcel she had passed him was not the end of their business. Something still remained. Something they were both anxious to retrieve before Graves found it. That evening, Harriet returned from Mrs. Partridge's with a morsel of gossip wrapped, as always, in good intentions. You'll like this, Jane. Mrs. Partridge swears she saw Clarissa at the station the morning after the murder, talking to the curate. They looked very serious, and when she approached, they stopped at once. Miss Marple smiled faintly. The curate again. Yes, that does interest me. She set her knitting aside. I think, Harriet, that the time has come to speak with Inspector Graves about a small test. One that might bring the truth into the open without anyone quite realizing it's happening. The next day, Graves listened with a mixture of skepticism and respect as Miss Marple outlined her idea. It involved a quiet announcement, spread discreetly through the village, that the police had discovered new evidence from the hatbox. Evidence that directly linked to the beneficiary of the contested will. The name, of course, would not be given. The purpose was simple, to see who reacted and how. You think someone will try to get ahead of us, Graves said. I think, Miss Marple replied, that when people believe their position is about to be exposed, they either run or attempt to recover control. Either way, they reveal themselves. That afternoon, the rumor began its gentle spread, thanks to a few well-placed confidences from Graves to those most likely to repeat them. By evening, Miss Marple had her chair by the parlor window, the curtains just open enough to see the lane. She did not have to wait long. At 8:30, almost exactly the same hour as the previous meeting at the coal shed, Clarissa Rowcroft passed by, walking quickly, a scarf drawn up about her face. 10 minutes later, Lionel Brooks followed, glancing over his shoulder more than once. And 5 minutes after that, the Reverend Phelps went by in the same direction, his hat pulled low. Miss Marple allowed herself a small, satisfied nod. 3 threads, all leading to the same place. Whatever lay at the heart of the last train to Bramble Halt, it was about to be drawn into the open, and she would be there to see the pattern complete itself. The Stiasta night was still and star-pricked when Miss Marple stepped out into the lane, her black shawl wrapped neatly about her shoulders. She moved with the quiet purpose of one who knows exactly where she is going and why. In Bramble Halt, the darkness carried sound with deceptive clarity. A footstep on gravel could be heard far beyond its source. For that reason, she kept to the verge, her shoes pressing softly into the grass. Ahead, the road dipped toward the station yard, where the lamps cast their uneven glow over the siding and the squat outline of the coal shed. She stopped just short of the bend, knowing the view would open up from there. It was enough to listen. A murmur of voices reached her. 3 at first, then 2, then 1 rising sharply before being cut off. She waited another moment before advancing the few yards that brought the scene into view. The shed door was ajar, the light from inside spilling in a narrow strip across the dirt. Inside, Lionel Brooks stood with his hands on his hips, facing Clarissa Rowcroft. The Reverend Phelps stood slightly apart, his face pale in the lamplight. On the ground between them lay the familiar green hat box, the lid askew. "You said it was gone," Lionel was saying, his voice low but hard. "And here it is. What am I supposed to think, Clarissa?" "I told you," Clarissa replied sharply. "I hid it here after the inspector's men searched the place. If they'd found it, we'd all be finished. I didn't dare take it home." The curate shifted uneasily. "We shouldn't even be here. If someone sees us—" "No one's going to see us," Clarissa cut in. "We just need to get what's inside and burn it." Miss Marple edged closer, careful to keep to the shadows. Lionel bent, lifted the hat box, and tipped it sideways. A bundle wrapped in oilskin slid out, hitting the ground with a soft thud. "That's it?" Lionel muttered. "After all this, just a bundle of paper?" "Not just paper," Clarissa said. "Those are the original copies. If the police get them, she'll win, and we get nothing." "She?" The curate's voice cracked slightly. "My cousin," Clarissa snapped. "The one Colston was working for. If she inherits, I'm out completely. But if these disappear, the case will collapse and the estate gets divided as before." There was a short silence. Miss Marple, still in shadow, found her suspicions knitting themselves into certainty. So the will's beneficiary was no stranger after all. It was someone directly linked to Clarissa, and Clarissa had the clearest motive to stop her cousin from inheriting. Lionel crouched, unwrapping the bundle enough to glance inside. "All right," he said finally. "We'll burn them tonight." "And what about the curate?" Clarissa asked. "He's already seen too much." The Reverend flushed. "I didn't ask to be dragged into this. I was just delivering the hat box to Much Hamilton, like you asked. I didn't know what was in it until afterwards." "You knew enough to keep quiet," Lionel said coldly, "which makes you as deep in it as we are." Miss Marple withdrew as quietly as she had come, slipping back up the lane. She had heard all she needed. By morning, the pattern she had suspected from the start was complete. Colston had brought the will copies to Much Hamilton to hand to the rightful beneficiary, Clarissa's cousin. Clarissa, with Lionel's help and the curate's unwitting assistance, had intercepted the hat box, taken the papers, and arranged for Colston's murder before he could change course or speak. The next morning was bright and deceptively peaceful. Miss Marple sent a short note to Inspector Graves, requesting his company at Mrs. Finch's after luncheon. When he arrived, she was already seated with her knitting, the teapot steaming on the tray. "I believe," she said without preamble, "that you will find the solution to this business at the coal shed if you go there now. Clarissa Rowcroft and Lionel Brooks have hidden the original will copies inside a hatbox. They plan to destroy them." Graves looked at her sharply. "You're certain?" "Quite. I was there last night and heard enough to be confident. You will also find the Reverend Phelps with them. He acted as a courier for the hatbox, not knowing its contents at the time, but has been too compromised to speak." Graves didn't waste time. Within the hour, his men had recovered the hatbox and its contents and brought all 3 suspects to the station. By late afternoon, word was already spreading through Bramble Halt, the details growing more embroidered with each telling. That evening, Graves stopped by to give Miss Marple the official outline. "You were right," he said grudgingly, though not without respect. Clarissa's cousin was the beneficiary in the will Colston carried. Clarissa intercepted it at Much Hamilton, had the curate deliver the hatbox so it wouldn't be traced to her directly. Brooks, we think, boarded the train at Much Hamilton, killed Colston with the bell cord, and left the carriage before Bramble Halt, rejoining later at the station to make it look as though he'd been a separate passenger. "And the curate?" Miss Marple asked. "Knew nothing of the murder," Graves said. But when he realized what he'd been part of, he kept quiet to protect Clarissa. Bad judgment, but not criminal in this case. He'll be resigning his post, though. I doubt the bishop would approve of a curate playing messenger in a plot like this. Miss Marple nodded. "I suspected as much." The high-heeled lady at Much Hamilton was Clarissa in a veil. The hatbox confusion, 2 in circulation, was deliberate to muddy any trail. And the empty box in the shed was a decoy, meant to make you believe the contents were already gone. Graves shook his head. "If not for you, we might have missed the second hatbox entirely." He hesitated. "One thing I don't understand. Why did Lionel keep the patched shoes? Surely he knew the cobbler could identify them." "Vanity," Miss Marple said gently. "Some men cannot bear to part with a pair of shoes they think particularly smart, even when they've been mended. And vanity, Inspector, is often a criminal's undoing." When Graves had gone, Harriet returned from her errands, full of curiosity. "Well, Jane? Was it really Clarissa?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, my dear. She was clever enough to think that 2 hatboxes, a willing young man, and an obliging curate would keep suspicion at bay. But cleverness is no match for a pattern once it's begun to take shape." They sat together as the evening deepened, the village outside settling into its quiet routines once more. The last train to Bramble Halt rattled past on schedule, its whistle echoing in the cool air. Miss Marple sipped her tea and reflected, as she often did, that human nature changes very little, whether in St. Mary Mead, in Bramble Halt, or anywhere else. There are always those who believe they can hide their motives behind polite smiles and respectable habits, forgetting that the smallest, most ordinary details, a shoe's worn patch, a misplaced hairpin, a footprint in soft earth, can speak louder than any protestation of innocence. And as the sound of the train faded into the distance, she knew that, in the quiet corners of every village, the next story was already beginning to unfold. The days that followed the arrests settled over Bramble Halt with the peculiar quiet that comes after a storm. People went about their errands more softly, as though speaking too loudly might disturb something still fragile in the air. The newspapers had carried a small column on the case, just enough to make the village feel itself momentarily at the center of a much larger world. But the excitement was already giving way to the comfort of routine. At Mrs. Finch's cottage, however, the events were still very much alive in conversation. Harriet was torn between pride at her friend's part in the matter and a lingering disbelief that murder had been plotted and carried out by people she had seen at garden teas and jumble sales. "To think," she said for perhaps the 10th time that week, "that Clarissa Rowcroft, so charming, so helpful with the church flowers, could be capable of such cold-blooded scheming. And Lionel, of course, always so attentive with his manners. I feel I shall never trust a polite young man again." Miss Marple, who was mending a glove, gave a soft chuckle. "It is a mistake, my dear, to think evil always presents itself in a disagreeable form. A great many unpleasant deeds are committed by people who are most amiable in company. That is why one must watch what they do when they think no one is looking." Harriet poured the tea. "Still, I don't see how you knew it was them. Even Inspector Graves seemed to think the suspects could be almost anyone in the village." "It was not a matter of knowing at once," Miss Marple said, laying the mended glove aside. "It was a matter of observing small things and seeing how they fitted together. For instance, Lionel's patched heel, such a trivial thing. Yet it placed him at the coal shed when he swore he had not been there. Clarissa's high-heeled shoes, matching the footprint in the yard, and her sudden recovery from a supposed headache at just the time when she was seen in much Hamilton with a veiled lady's appearance. The curate's late-night walk and his unease when questioned. And, of course, the existence of 2 identical hat boxes." Harriet nodded slowly. "I suppose each by itself might mean nothing." "Quite so," Miss Marple agreed. "But together they formed a pattern, one designed to confuse. The empty hat box in the shed was a decoy, meant to suggest that the contents had already been taken elsewhere. But the presence of graphite dust in both boxes told me the papers had been in each at some point, and therefore that there was a deliberate exchange." Harriet sighed. "And poor Mr. Phelps, caught up in it all. What will become of him?" "I believe," Miss Marple said gently, "he will leave Bramble Halt. His part was one of foolish trust rather than malice. But he will not easily regain the confidence of his parish. Perhaps he will find a post somewhere quiet, where people are glad of his kindness and less inclined to question his judgment." The front gate clicked, and Inspector Graves appeared, hat in hand. Harriet bustled off to fetch another cup, while Graves took a seat opposite Miss Marple. "I thought you'd like to know," he said, "that Clarissa has decided to make a full statement. She admits to planning the interception of the will copies, though she still claims she left the actual killing to Lionel. He, for his part, insists the death was an accident, that he only meant to frighten Colston into handing over what he had. But the evidence of the bell-cord loop says otherwise." "And the motive?" Miss Marple asked. "As you suspected, Clarissa's cousin was the main beneficiary in the disputed will, which would have left Clarissa with nothing. The estate is considerable, enough to tempt even the best-bred lady into taking risks. Brooks saw an opportunity to profit by helping her. They used the curate to move the hat box under the pretense of an errand for a lady parishioner, then met Colston at Much Hamilton to exchange it. Brooks boarded the train afterwards, killed Colston before Bramble Halt, and slipped away during the brief stop before anyone realized." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Greed is a powerful motivator, Inspector. But so too is fear. Fear of losing what one believes should be one's own. Clarissa no doubt convinced herself she was merely defending her rights." Graves gave a short laugh. I suppose so. Still, I can't help thinking you should be on the payroll, Miss Marple. I've had sergeants with half your instincts and twice the training. She smiled modestly. Experience in human nature, Inspector, is often worth more than formal instruction, and one can learn a great deal in a village, though people rarely realize how much they reveal when they think they are merely making conversation. When Graves had gone, Harriet returned with the tea things. It's a relief to have it settled, though I can't say I shall miss either of them. But Jane, do you ever feel sorry for people like that? People who go wrong? Miss Marple's gaze was thoughtful. I feel sorry for the waste, my dear. They could have lived quiet, contented lives. But ambition and resentment have a way of spoiling even the most promising dispositions. It is like a blight on roses. You may tend them well, but one day you find the petals mottled and the leaves withering, and there is nothing to be done but cut away the diseased parts. In the days that followed, Bramble Halt's gossip began to turn toward other matters. A new family moving into Rose Cottage, the preparations for the autumn fete, the rumor that the railway might reduce the last train's schedule. Life, as it always does, shifted back toward the comfortable and the ordinary. Yet now and again, a conversation would circle back to the murder, and someone would remark on how impossible it had seemed until it happened here. One afternoon, while Miss Marple was in the garden, Mrs. Larkin from the post office stopped at the gate. "Miss Marple," she said, "I hope you don't mind me saying so, but it's a comfort to know you're about. If anything dreadful should happen again, at least we've someone who can see through it." Miss Marple smiled, her hands deep in the soil around a clump of late-blooming chrysanthemums. "That's kind of you, Mrs. Larkin. But I do hope the need won't arise. Murder is a most inconvenient business for a village. It upsets the routines." Mrs. Larkin laughed and went on her way, leaving Miss Marple to her plants and her thoughts. She knew, of course, that crime was no respecter of location. Whether in the bustle of London or the quiet of Bramble Halt, it was always born from the same human impulses: jealousy, greed, revenge, desperation. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the familiar whistle of the last train echoed faintly in the distance, Miss Marple sat by the fire with her knitting. Harriet, across from her with a book, looked up and said, "Do you suppose, Jane, that we'll ever take that train again without thinking of Mr. Colston?" Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. "In time, perhaps. But there will always be a certain association, just as there is with places where one has been especially happy or especially sad. Memory leaves its own kind of footprint." The clock on the mantel ticked softly. Outside, the night settled over Bramble Halt, bringing with it the comfortable sense that for now all was in order. Yet Miss Marple, with her long habit of observing the ways of the world, knew that somewhere, in some other quiet place, another pattern was already forming. One that would, in its turn, require patient eyes and a listening ear to set right. And so she set another neat row of stitches, content in the knowledge that, whatever came, she would be ready to see it through to its proper end. The autumn fete was set for the following Saturday, and Bramble Halt threw itself into preparations with the brisk enthusiasm of a place eager to overwrite a recent scandal. Stalls were arranged on the green. Bunting was strung between the trees, and the air was thick with the smells of baking, polish, and chrysanthemums. Miss Marple, in her usual unassuming way, had allowed herself to be placed in charge of the handicrafts stall, which gave her a perfect vantage point to see the comings and goings without attracting undue attention. She worked with neat precision, setting out baskets of knitted scarves and embroidered tea cozies, her eyes wandering now and again to the people drifting past. What interested her most was not the crowd's chatter about the fete, but the way certain names were still spoken in undertones. Clarissa Rowcroft and Lionel Brooks were now awaiting trial, yet their absence left a kind of gap in the village's social fabric, a space into which speculation still crept. The Reverend Phelps, though officially cleared of criminal wrongdoing, had announced he would be leaving for a post in a remote northern parish to reflect and renew. It was said in some quarters that his sermons would be sorely missed, in others that his departure was for the best. Harriet bustled up to the stall mid-morning, cheeks pink from the brisk wind. "Jane, you'll never guess. Mrs. Pratt swears she heard from her cousin's husband's sister in Much Hamilton that the Rowcroft solicitor has been trying to keep certain family matters out of the newspapers. For the sake of the elderly," she said. Harriet lowered her voice. "I suppose she means Mrs. Rowcroft herself. Poor woman. Imagine discovering your own nieces capable of such things." "Families," Miss Marple said gently, "often prefer their troubles to be private. It spares them the unpleasantness of other people's pity, or worse, their curiosity." By midday, the fete was in full swing. The brass band played on the far side of the green. Children darted between the stalls with sticky fingers, and the cake competition was being hotly debated by the judges. Yet Miss Marple could not quite shake the sense that a shadow of the last train business still lingered. The villagers smiled and chatted, but their glances sometimes strayed toward the railway line at the edge of the green, as though half expecting another train to pull in with news. Inspector Graves made an appearance in the early afternoon, tipping his hat to Miss Marple as he passed. He had none of his usual harried air today. Instead, he seemed almost relaxed. "Thought I'd stop by before heading to the station," he told her. "All quiet at the moment, you'll be glad to know. The paperwork's another matter, of course." Miss Marple smiled. "Paperwork is the sort of crime that never gets solved, Inspector. But I dare say you're the man for it." Graves gave a short laugh. "After this last business, a bit of tedium is welcome. I'll tell you something, though. Most of the evidence we found wouldn't have meant a thing to us if you hadn't put it together. We had all the pieces, but no picture." "It's often like that," Miss Marple replied. "The pieces themselves rarely shout their meaning. It's in how they fit together that the truth emerges." Later in the afternoon, Miss Marple found herself briefly alone at the stall. A shadow fell across the table, and she looked up to find Mrs. Larkin from the post office standing there. "Lovely day for it," Mrs. Larkin said, fingering a knitted muffler. Then, in a lower tone, "I suppose you've heard about the letter?" Miss Marple's eyes brightened just slightly. "Letter?" Mrs. Larkin glanced about before continuing. "Came through the post 2 days ago for Mrs. Rowcroft, forwarded from her solicitor in London. The handwriting was shaky, the sort you get from someone old or unwell. I didn't see the contents, of course, but I couldn't help noticing the postmark, Malta. Imagine that." Miss Marple made a sympathetic noise. "Yes, that is unusual." And it was. Letters from Malta were not an everyday occurrence in Bramble Halt, and the fact that this one came in the midst of the family's legal troubles was enough to stir her curiosity. Harriet returned soon after, and Miss Marple kept the detail to herself. She had learned long ago that some threads were best pulled quietly, without the whole village seeing the unraveling. As the sun dipped and the fete wound down, Miss Marple walked home with Harriet, who was still buzzing with the day's events. That evening, Once Harriet was occupied in the kitchen, Miss Marple took out her small notebook and wrote, "Malta letter, Mrs. Rowcroft," at the top of a fresh page. Beneath it, she added, "Possible connection to disputed will? Relative abroad?" She sat for a moment, considering. The murder of Ernest Colston had been resolved in the legal sense, but the human tangle behind it was rarely so neatly finished. If the beneficiary in the contested will was still abroad, perhaps the letter had been from her, arriving too late to save Colston, but perhaps containing something that could complicate matters yet. The following day, she found an excuse to stop at the post office. Mrs. Larkin, as expected, was full of her own news and needed little prompting to expand on the letter. "Oh, it was collected right away," she said. "Mrs. Rowcroft came herself, which is unusual. Usually she sends Clarissa, you know." She didn't linger to chat, just signed for it and left. Looked as though she'd rather no one saw her. Miss Marple merely nodded and purchased a book of stamps. By the time she stepped back into the street, she had decided she would mention the letter to Inspector Graves. Not because she suspected new wrongdoing, but because experience had taught her that loose ends, if left untended, had a habit of knotting themselves into larger problems. Graves listened with interest when she called on him that afternoon. "Malta, you say? That's interesting." The cousin, the will's beneficiary, was living abroad, though we didn't have a confirmed address. Could be coincidence, of course. But I'll make inquiries. By the week's end, Graves returned with the answer. It was from the cousin, he said, written before she knew anything about the murder. She'd heard through family channels that Colston might be traveling with the will copies, and she wanted Mrs. Rowcroft to understand she meant to claim her rightful inheritance, whatever anyone in Bramble Halt thought. It's not evidence of anything criminal now, but it does confirm she was the intended recipient. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Then the pattern is quite complete. The motive, the means, and the human impulses behind them, all of a piece. Graves shook his head with a rueful smile. "I don't know how you do it, Miss Marple, but I'm glad you do." When he had gone, Miss Marple sat for a while by the window, watching the last of the fete decorations being taken down from the green. Life in Bramble Halt was settling into its old rhythms. Yet she knew that this episode would be remembered for years to come. Not for the sensation of it, but for the quiet, lingering awareness that even here, among rose gardens and polite conversation, the darker shades of human nature could flourish. She took up her knitting, content to let the clink of the needles and the soft hum of Harriet in the kitchen draw the day to its close. Outside, the sound of the distant evening train carried faintly on the breeze, a reminder that the line to much Hamilton and beyond still ran, and that every arrival and departure brought with it the possibility of new stories waiting quietly to be told. 2 weeks after the fete, Bramble Halt had all but returned to its gentle, uneventful rhythm. The leaves had begun to turn, the air was crisper, and the late roses in Mrs. Finch's garden were giving their final performance before winter. In the high street, the shopkeeper's chatter had returned to the safe ground of weather, parish events, and the price of coal. Yet now and again, a remark about that business on the last train would slip into conversation, usually accompanied by a glance to see who might be listening. Miss Marple, for her part, was content to let the village talk itself quiet. She had no need to revisit the case. Her mind was at peace with the outcome, and she knew Inspector Graves's work was thorough enough to see it through the courts. What interested her now were the small adjustments people made in the wake of such an event. How Mrs. Rowcroft carried herself with just a touch more stiffness in public. How Lionel Brooks's empty chair in the pub was quietly filled by another without comment. How the Reverend Phelps's departure was marked by a polite but subdued farewell gathering in the church hall. It was on the morning of the curate's last Sunday service that Miss Marple found herself in the pew beside Harriet. The Reverend's sermon was a cautious one, full of gentle exhortations to live honestly and avoid temptation, though he avoided anything that might sound too pointed. When it was over, the congregation filed past him, offering handshakes and polite wishes. Miss Marple noted that Clarissa's name was not mentioned at all. In villages, the absence of a name is often louder than any spoken word. Later that day, Harriet set out a small tea in honor of the occasion. "It's rather sad," she admitted, pouring Miss Marple a cup. "I don't think he's a bad man, just easily led." Miss Marple nodded. "Many people are, my dear. It is not always wickedness that leads to trouble, but weakness. And weakness can be just as dangerous in the wrong circumstances." Harriet sighed. "Do you think we'll see anything like this again here?" Miss Marple smiled slightly. "I should be very pleased if we did not. But villages are like anywhere else. Human nature is the same in every place. Where there is envy, greed, or resentment, the seeds are sown. Whether they sprout is another matter." That afternoon, Miss Marple took a slow walk through the village. At the station, she paused to watch the arrival of the mid-afternoon train from Much Hamilton. Passengers disembarked. 2 businessmen, a woman with a child, a pair of elderly ladies on their way to visit relations. The scene was as ordinary as it could be. Yet she could not help but remember that only a short while ago, another arrival had carried with it danger and death. Mr. Carter, the station master, spotted her and tipped his cap. "Afternoon, Miss Marple. Peaceful enough these days, thank the Lord." "Yes, indeed," she said. "Let us hope it continues so." On her way back, she passed Rose Cottage, where new tenants had moved in. A quiet couple who kept to themselves. Their presence had already begun to change the tone of conversation around the place, pushing the memory of Clarissa's visits further into the background. That was the way of villages. Life closed over its disturbances like water over a stone, leaving only the faintest ripple. That evening, as she sat with Harriet by the fire, Miss Marple reflected on how the smallest things had led to the unraveling of the case. The patched heel, the bent hairpin, the footprint in the yard. None of them, taken alone, would have convinced anyone of guilt. But together, they had formed a chain as strong as any, forged in iron. Harriet broke into her thoughts. "You know, Jane, I think you see more than anyone else I know. You notice things I'd never think important." Miss Marple's smile was gentle. "It isn't cleverness, my dear, merely habit. One observes, one remembers, and one sees how things connect. People are very much alike everywhere, and their little habits give them away, whether in St. Mary Mead or Bramble Halt. The days shortened, the evenings grew colder, and the talk of the murder gradually became the sort of story that was told to visitors as an interesting bit of local history, already softened at the edges and destined in time to become almost folklore. Miss Marple knew this was inevitable. The village would go on as it always had, with its teas, its fetes, its quiet rivalries, and its occasional flashes of pettiness or kindness. The last train to Bramble Halt would continue to come and go, carrying its passengers without incident. But she also knew that somewhere, one day, another train, or another gathering, or another seemingly ordinary afternoon, would bring something unexpected and perhaps unwelcome. For now, however, she was content to return to her knitting, to her garden, and to the pleasant, slow rhythms of the place. Outside, the wind rustled through the turning leaves, and far off, faint but clear, came the whistle of the evening train. Miss Marple looked up from her work, her eyes soft but alert. Human nature, she thought, was as constant as the timetable. Predictable in its unpredictability, and never entirely at rest. She smiled to herself, set another stitch, and let the fire's warmth fold around her. It was 3 days after the curate's farewell service when Inspector Graves called at Mrs. Finch's cottage one last time. The day was brisk and clear, and he seemed almost lighter in step, as though setting down the final weight of the case. Miss Marple received him in the parlor, her knitting set neatly aside, a pot of tea already warm on the table. "Well, Miss Marple," he began, settling into the armchair opposite. "I thought you'd like to hear the court's decision. Clarissa Rowcroft has pled guilty to conspiracy and obstruction of justice, sparing herself the noose, though she'll have many years to reflect. Lionel Brooks was found guilty of murder. No question in the jury's mind once they heard the evidence about the patched heel, the train timings, and the bell cord. As for the Reverend Phelps, he's been formally cleared. His only fault was in trusting the wrong person. He left this morning for his new post up north." Miss Marple poured the tea, her manner as calm as if they were discussing the weather. "A fair outcome, I think. Clarissa was the mind, Lionel the hand, and the curate merely a pawn, though a careless one. It would be unjust to place them all in the same category." Graves gave a small grunt of agreement. "You know, what strikes me most is how ordinary it all looked at first. Just a stranger found dead on a train. If not for your noticing the small things, the shoes, the hairpin, the second hat box, we might never have seen the whole picture." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "It's like a dropped stitch, Inspector. One can ignore it for a while, but sooner or later it will run all the way down and spoil the whole piece unless you catch it early. The patched heel told me Lionel had been somewhere he denied. The hairpin and the high-heeled footprint tied Clarissa to the station yard. The 2 hat boxes explained the deliberate confusion. And from there, it was only a matter of arranging them in their proper order." Graves sipped his tea, regarding her with that blend of curiosity and admiration he had come to reserve for their conversations. "And the motive, money and resentment. Nothing fancy after all." "Nothing ever is," Miss Marple said. "People will dress up their motives in all sorts of finery, family honor, self-protection, even love. But when you strip away the trimmings, it's usually money, revenge, or fear. Clarissa's case was a tidy mixture of all three." He smiled, set down his cup, and rose. "Well, I'll be off. Let's hope the next time I come to Bramble Halt, it's for the fete or the flower show, and not for business." After he had gone, Harriet emerged from the kitchen, curiosity lighting her face. "Was that the inspector? Is it all settled?" "All settled," Miss Marple confirmed. She took up her knitting again, the familiar click of the needles resuming in the quiet room. "Justice, such as it is, has been done. And the village will now do what it always does, tuck the memory away until it's safe to bring out again over tea as a story for visitors." Harriet shook her head. "It still feels strange, Jane, knowing it all began with the last train to Bramble Halt." Miss Marple gave a small smile. "Strange, perhaps. But beginnings are often hidden in endings, and endings in beginnings. One must simply be willing to look closely." Outside, the faint whistle of the afternoon train carried across the fields, untroubled and on time. Life in Bramble Halt had found its rhythm again, but in Miss Marple's mind, the case was a quiet reminder that the truth is rarely loud, but always there, waiting for the right eyes to see it.